Imagine walking into a medieval winter. Not the soft, gentle winters we sometimes picture, but the long, bitter ones that pressed against wooden doors, froze the edges of fields, and slowed entire villages into a quiet, breath-held stillness. The cold didn't just chill the air. It changed the way people lived, cooked, stored, and survived. And yet, despite the frost, ordinary families found ways to keep warm, to stay fed, and to stretch their modest supplies through months when the earth offered almost nothing fresh. Tonight on Boring History for Sleep, we're going to drift back into those winters and gently explore what people truly ate when snow covered the countryside and the world moved a little slower. No drama, no hardship stories, just the calm, steady routines of medieval households preparing, storing, sharing, and making the most of every simple ingredient they had. You might be surprised at how much of their winter habits still survive in our kitchens today. The warm stews, the preserved vegetables, the stored grains, the comforting routines of evening meals. Winter cooking wasn't glamorous, but it was thoughtful, practical, and deeply human. Before we settle in and begin this peaceful journey, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment about which part of medieval life you're most curious about next. Your support helps keep these calm bedtime histories alive. Now, get comfortable, relax your breathing, and let's begin. If you want to understand what ordinary people ate during the harsh winters of medieval Europe, you have to begin months earlier. Long before winter arrived, long before snow covered the fields, and long before families gathered around their hearths to warm themselves against the cold. Winter food was not something medieval people discovered suddenly when the cold season came. It was something they quietly built piece by piece throughout the year, especially during the warm and generous months of late summer and early autumn. And if you could step softly into a medieval village during that time, you would immediately see the foundation of winter eating being shaped through simple tasks, practical decisions, and careful observations that defined everyday life. When the summer sun was still warm but the days had begun to shorten, medieval families already thought of winter. They didn't fear it in a dramatic way, but they respected its demands. They knew the earth would soon rest, the fields would grow silent, and the world outside would offer very little. So everything they did at the end of the year, every harvest they gathered, every grain they stored, every vegetable they dried, every herb they hung from the rafters, was a quiet promise to themselves that winter would be manageable, peaceful, and gently sustained by the work they did when the world was still warm. Grains were the earliest and most essential part of this preparation. Medieval families didn't measure grains in small bowls or tiny sacks. They measured them in baskets, barrels, and bins. Barley, oats, rye, and sometimes wheat were gathered in large quantities, dried properly, and stored in a cool, dry corner of the home or the cellar. These grains formed the backbone of winter eating. They did not spoil easily, did not rot in the cold, and did not require any special tools to prepare. With grains, a family could always make something warm: porridge, simple breads, thick soups, or grain-based dishes that filled the stomach and warmed the body. Even in modern times, many homes instinctively stock up on similar foods when the weather turns cold. The shelves fill with oatmeal, flour, rice, pasta, or other sturdy ingredients that can be turned into comforting meals. This habit feels modern, but its roots go deep into medieval kitchens where winter survival depended on shelves full of long-lasting staples. Alongside grains, medieval people relied heavily on root vegetables. These humble, sturdy foods, turnips, carrots, onions, cabbage, leeks, were perfect winter companions. They didn't grow in winter, of course, but they stored exceptionally well. Families pulled them from the earth before the first frost, cleaned them lightly without removing all the protective soil, and placed them in cool spaces where they could breathe. Some people buried them in storage pits lined with straw. Others placed them in cellars dug beneath their homes. No matter the exact method, the goal was the same: keep the vegetables cool, dry, and undisturbed so they would last deep into winter. If you imagine a medieval cellar during these months, you might see rows of basket vegetables resting quietly in the dim light. They didn't need modern refrigeration. The natural temperature of the ground kept them safe. These vegetables would become essential winter meals, boiled with grains, added to stews, roasted near the fire, or simmered into soft, warm dishes eaten at the end of long evenings. When you think of today's winter cooking, Big pots of soup, roasted root vegetables, warm casseroles. The resemblance is striking. Humans still feel drawn to foods that offer warmth, steadiness, and comfort during colder seasons. Medieval food instincts still live in us. Drying and preserving food was another central part of medieval winter preparation. Families used the late summer sun and the gentle warmth of their hearth to dry apples, beans, plums, herbs, and sometimes even strips of fish. Drying foods was simple, affordable, and effective. Dried foods lasted for months and took up little space. They provided important variety in winter eating, adding small notes of sweetness or freshness to otherwise simple meals. And again, this old rhythm exists today. We keep dried fruit in our pantries, dried beans on our shelves, jars of herbs within reach. We reach for these foods in colder months without thinking about how ancient the habit truly is. Herbs were another important part of winter preparations. Medieval homes dried herbs above their hearths, letting the gentle heat of daily cooking create the perfect environment for preserving flavor. Bundles of thyme, sage, rosemary, and other herbs hung from wooden beams, slowly transforming into the dried seasonings that would brighten winter dishes. You can almost picture the sight. Soft green bundles rustling slightly when someone walked past, filling the room with a faint, pleasant smell. Even now, dried herbs remain essential in winter meals. Kitchens around the world keep jars of them on shelves because the comfort of herbs in winter is timeless. As autumn deepened, medieval households began setting up their winter larder. This was not a fancy pantry or a luxurious storage space. It was often just a cool corner of a house, a cellar beneath the floorboards, or a small separate structure where the temperature stayed low. Inside, families stored grains, vegetables, dried fruits, preserved beans, nuts, cheese wrapped carefully in cloth, sometimes a bit of salted or dried fish, and other simple staples. The winter larder represented calm preparation. When a family looked into their larder before winter began, what they saw was not abundance in a luxurious sense, but enough. Enough to be warm, enough to feel secure, enough to trust the cold months ahead. Today's pantries are the descendants of those medieval larders. Even people who don't think of themselves as planners often feel a quiet instinct to prepare their kitchen before winter begins, buying soups, dry goods, or ingredients that feel comforting. It is a human rhythm shaped by centuries of winter survival. Another essential part of winter preparation was firewood. Food didn't cook itself, and medieval meals were slow by nature. Stews simmered, porridges thickened, bread baked near the fire. Families gathered and stacked wood carefully, preparing not only for warmth, but also for the cooking that would sustain them for months. Without wood, even the most well-stocked larder was useless. Food in winter was inseparable from heat. Even today, the warmth of winter cooking, soups bubbling, bread baking, tea steeping, creates a feeling of comfort that links us directly to those old kitchens where heat and food were one. As the days grew colder and the first frost touched the ground, medieval families gradually shifted their routines. Work moved indoors. Fields became quiet. But the kitchen, the hearth, the larder, these places came to life. Winter eating was not dramatic or extravagant. It was slow, steady, and deeply connected to the preparations made earlier in the year. Families leaned on their stored grains, their root vegetables, their dried foods, their herbs, and their simple techniques. Meals were not celebrated for their complexity, but for their reliability. Something warm, something hearty, something filling. That was the true measure of winter comfort. Even in the quiet darkness of medieval winters, there was a calm confidence in the routines that had been practiced for generations. People trusted the earth's gifts, trusted their preparations, trusted the rhythm of storing, drying, and saving. Winter wasn't a surprise. It was a season people met with readiness, shaped by patient work. So what did ordinary people eat in harsh medieval winters? The answer begins here. They ate warmth created months before the cold arrived. They ate patience. They ate planning. They ate the quiet comforts of simple foods stored with care. And even now, centuries later, our winter plates still carry those old rhythms, tucked gently into the habits we barely notice. When the first true weeks of winter finally settled over a medieval village, the entire rhythm of daily life changed. The trees stood bare and still. The fields, once noisy with tools and footsteps, became quiet beneath a thin layer of frost or snow. The wind turned sharper, threading through wooden shutters and brushing against the edges of rooftops. And inside every home, families instinctively drew closer to the hearth, instinctively turned toward the warmth and familiarity of the kitchen, and instinctively relied on the food they had prepared months earlier. Winter in medieval Europe wasn't sudden panic or desperation. It was a slow settling into a season people understood deeply. The earth rested, and so did they. But their food routines took on a new focus, a gentle discipline shaped by centuries of experience. In those first winter weeks, the most immediate change was the pace of meals. In warmer seasons, food preparation could spill outside, ingredients could be gathered fresh, and tasks were scattered throughout the day. But once winter arrived, nearly everything happened indoors. The hearth became the true center of life, not only for warmth, but for every meal, every conversation, every moment of gathering. Families shifted closer to it, placing stools, benches, and baskets of ingredients nearby. The sound of crackling would become a constant companion, and the steady warmth of fire shaped the flavor and texture of winter dishes in ways modern kitchens rarely experience. The first meals of winter almost always came from the top layers of the larder, the items easiest to reach, the foods that wouldn't last as long, the vegetables that needed attention before they softened. Cabbage, for example, was often used early. Though sturdy, it was not meant to last endlessly, so it found its way into many early winter dishes. Families would chop the large heads into thick slices and boil them gently with a handful of barley or oats. The result was a simple but satisfying dish, warm, soft, and filling. Even today, many winter recipes begin with cabbage and grains, and that instinct comes from these old routines where practicality quietly shaped comfort. Onions, another staple, were used frequently in the first weeks of winter. Their sharpness mellowed with time, and medieval cooks understood how easily onions transformed a basic pot of grains or root vegetables into something fragrant and soothing. In the early days of winter, the smell of onions sizzling near the fire or simmering in the hearth pot filled homes with the kind of warmth that made the whole season feel a little gentler. Even now, one of the first steps in many winter dishes is softening onions in a warm pot, a rhythm unchanged after centuries. Perhaps the most iconic winter food during these early weeks was porridge. Not the modern version made from fine oats and flavored with fruit, but thick, hearty mixtures made from barley, rye, or whatever grain had been most abundant in summer. Families often prepared large pots of porridge in the morning, not because it was glamorous, but because it could warm many people, last throughout the day, and be adjusted with whatever ingredients were available. Some days it was plain, with only a pinch of herbs. Other days it might include pieces of carrot or turnip. On better days, someone might drop a little honey or a handful of dried fruit into the pot. Porridge wasn't a single dish. It was a canvas shaped by the simplicity of winter ingredients. The reason porridge became such a trusted early winter meal was not only its warmth, but its efficiency. It simmered slowly and could be lifted closer or farther from the fire to control its thickness. It required only one pot, which saved fuel. It filled stomachs with long-lasting comfort, allowing families to work on indoor winter tasks without feeling hungry too quickly. Even today, porridge-like meals, thick soups, stews, slow-cooked grains, are among the most comforting foods in winter, and that feeling comes directly from the medieval tradition of beginning winter with dishes that soothe and sustain. Another early winter routine involved dried beans and peas. These legumes, carefully stored during the harvest season, were often soaked the night before cooking. Medieval cooks didn't rush them. They simply placed them in water near the hearth, letting the warmth soften them gradually. By morning, the beans could be cooked into a simple stew or mixed with grains. The process was slow and patient, and that patience created depth of flavor. Many winter dishes today still begin with soaking beans overnight, a medieval habit passed down quietly through generations. If you imagine a medieval household during these early winter weeks, you would notice how smoothly ingredients moved from storage to cooking. There was no fuss, no dramatic decision-making. People simply reached for what made sense that day. The larder became a guide. Softer vegetables came first. Grains were taken gradually. Herbs were used sparingly but thoughtfully. Dried foods were prized for their longevity, and stored ingredients were treated with respect. Winter wasn't a time of abundance, but it wasn't a time of panic either. It was a season of gentle, measured use. Bread was another important part of the early winter diet. Families often baked large loaves that lasted several days. These weren't soft, airy loaves like many modern breads. They were dense, sturdy, and meant to be eaten slowly. In the first weeks of winter, bread accompanied nearly every meal. It was dipped into soups, eaten with porridge, or placed near the fire to soften before being used. Medieval bread acted as both food and tool. It collected the last bits of stew from bowls, thickened porridges, and sometimes even served as an edible plate for small portions of food. The rhythm of baking bread in winter, less often, but in larger quantities, still appears today in the way people gravitate toward home baking as the cold sets in. One of the most interesting aspects of early winter eating is how medieval families treated their food with gentle discipline. They didn't indulge in ingredients that were meant to last into the deeper, harsher months. They didn't use their driest vegetables first, nor did they reach immediately for the most flavorful preserved foods. They viewed winter as a long journey, and the first steps needed to be taken carefully. This slow, thoughtful consumption is something many modern households practice without thinking. People often save certain foods for later in the winter, gravitate towards simple meals at the start, and reserve special items for deeper winter days, an echo of the medieval instinct for preserving variety as long as possible. In the first few weeks of winter, families also consumed more dairy-like products stored from autumn. Hard cheeses wrapped in cloth and kept in cool spaces were eaten sparingly because they lasted well into winter. They could be sliced thinly, grated into stews, or eaten with bread. Milk was not available in abundance during the cold seasons, so early winter was the last moment when some households still had access to fresh dairy from animals that had not yet entered the deepest part of their seasonal cycle. Because of this, early winter meals might include small amounts of fresh or slightly aged dairy, but families knew these supplies wouldn't last long. As families settled into winter routines, the hearth became the central piece of life in a way that modern kitchens rarely experience. It was both stove and heater, both light and comfort. Meals were cooked in a predictable rhythm. Something simmered, something warmed, something softened near the edges of the fire. The hearth wasn't simply a tool. It shaped the entire flavor of winter. Slow-cooked dishes emerged naturally because they fit the nature of the season. Even the simplest ingredients tasted rich when given hours to meld gently. Modern slow cookers, long-simmered stews, and overnight oats are shadows of this ancient rhythm. The instinct to let food cook slowly in winter, to allow flavors to deepen while the house stays warm, comes directly from the medieval experience of cooking near a constant fire. During these first weeks of winter, families also began developing a new routine around mealtime, conserving fuel. Wood was precious. Every log burned too quickly meant one less log for the harsher months ahead. So meals used as few pots as possible, relied on longer simmering instead of fast boiling, and often cooked multiple components in the same vessel. This created a subtle, practical flavor profile. Meals were unified, soft, and layered. The practice of cooking one-pot winter meals persists today because it feels comforting and wise, even when fuel is no longer scarce. Another subtle but important part of early winter eating was the emotional comfort that came from routine. Medieval families didn't look outside for fresh inspiration. The world outside was quiet and still. Instead, they turned inward toward the familiarity of their stored foods. There was something deeply calming about knowing exactly what was available and how long it would last. Modern winter habits reflect this same comfort. Many people prefer predictable meals in colder months, choose familiar dishes, and find stability in repetition. It is a human response shaped over centuries of winter living. Early winter evenings in medieval Europe were long and dark, and meals often acted as anchors in the quiet. When daylight faded quickly and work slowed, families gathered closer to the hearth, not only to eat but to rest from the cold. The warm bowls in their hands weren't tea, just food. They were reassurance that the season could be met with calm. Even today, winter meals often become moments of pause, comfort, and reflection. They slow the day's pace, soften the evening, and prepare the mind for rest. In these first few weeks of winter, medieval households rarely felt deprived. They had fresh memories of the harvest, a well-stocked larder, and a sense of confidence in their preparations. Winter was still new, still manageable, still full of possibility. The hardest months were not yet upon them, and the variety of foods available, though simple, was still comforting and familiar. The beginning of winter was, in many ways, the easiest part. People adjusted their routines, settled into new rhythms, and reassured themselves with the warm meals created from the work of the previous season. What ordinary people ate during early medieval winters wasn't luxurious or surprising. It was sensible, practical, and nourishing. They leaned on grains, on stored vegetables, on dried foods, on slow-simmered dishes, and on the hearth that warmed both food and spirit. These foods weren't just survival. They were tradition, routine, and comfort. In the next chapter, we'll drift deeper into winter, exploring what happened when the cold settled fully, when supplies thinned, and when meals became simpler and more resourceful than ever, revealing how creativity and patience shaped the heart of medieval winter cooking. When deep winter finally settled its full weight across medieval Europe, everything changed once again. The early winter weeks had been a gentle adjustment, a shift toward indoor routines and warm meals cooked from the freshest stored foods. But as the cold grew sharper, as snow lay more thickly on the ground, and as daylight hours shortened into narrow ribbons of gray, medieval families entered the true heart of winter, the long, quiet middle stretch where every decision around food mattered more than ever. It was during this time, when the world outside was silent and unmoving, that ordinary people relied most heavily on their planning, their instinct, and their patience. Winter became less of a season and more of a state of mind, slow, deliberate, careful, and deeply connected to the rhythm of simple survival. In these harshest weeks, the world beyond the home offered almost nothing fresh. The fields were frozen, the gardens slept, and even hardy plants waited silently for the return of warmth. This meant that medieval families turned almost entirely to their larder. Every step toward food began by stepping deeper into the cold room or cellar where the year's harvest rested. And because deep winter could last for months, families had to balance their use of ingredients with a quiet discipline. They no longer reached for the foods that softened quickly or those meant to be eaten early. Instead, they turned to the strong, durable staples that could withstand the longest stretch of cold weather. Grains were the most dependable of these staples: barley, rye, oats, and sometimes wheat, though wheat was rarer for ordinary families, became the dependable base of meals day after day. People prepared them in countless ways, yet always within the limits of what winter allowed. Thick porridges simmered near the hearth, not as a special dish, but as a daily comfort. The texture of medieval porridge in deep winter was often thicker than the versions cooked in warmer months. Families cooked grain longer to maximize warmth and flavor, letting it absorb as much water as possible so it stretched further. A pot of porridge near the fire could warm many stomachs and last many hours. And because everyone in the household helped in some way, stirring, adding a pinch of herbs, adjusting the pot's distance from the fire, the dish carried the quiet cooperation of daily life. Vegetables in deep winter became simpler and fewer in variety, but those still available played an important role. Root vegetables kept their firmness even as the cold outside deepened. Carrots, turnips, beets, parsnips, and onions rested in storage pits or baskets, waiting patiently to be peeled, chopped, and added to winter stews. These vegetables did not spoil quickly, but they did require careful handling. Medieval families often checked their stored produce regularly, removing anything that softened or changed texture too much. This routine, though simple, preserved the usefulness of every ingredient, and every small effort counted. Even one extra week of a vegetable's life meant one more warm meal in deep winter. On days when the cold seemed especially heavy, medieval cooks often combined grains and vegetables into hearty one-pot dishes. These weren't elaborate recipes. They were practical combinations: a handful of grain, pieces of root vegetables, maybe a dried bean or two, cooked slowly until everything softened into something comforting. The fragrance that drifted from such pots, earthy vegetables mingled with warm grains, became the scent of winter itself. Even today, dishes like vegetable barley soup or root vegetable stew carry the same winter rhythm, reminding us of centuries when people made the most of the earth's simplest offerings. The role of dried foods grew even more important during deep winter. In autumn, families had hung beans to dry, strung fruits near the hearth, and preserved herbs. Now, those dried foods became little treasures that brought both nutrition and variety to otherwise repetitive meals. Dried beans were soaked overnight near the fire and then simmered in morning pots. They softened slowly, releasing their earthy flavor into the broth. For many families, beans were one of the few reliable sources of protein during this season, and their presence in the pot made meals feel more substantial. Dried fruits, though not common for everyone, offered small but meaningful touches of sweetness during long winter weeks. Medieval people cherished dried apples, plums, and pears, not as desserts, but as delightful additions that broke the monotony of winter meals. A handful of dried apple slices added to porridge or a few dried plums softened in a warm dish could create a moment of comfort that carried emotional weight far beyond their size. In modern kitchens, the use of dried fruits in winter dishes still brings the same quiet pleasure, an echo of the medieval instinct that sweetness should be gentle, warming, and rare enough to feel special. Herbs, too, played a crucial role in deep winter. The bundles that had been hung to dry in late summer were now dry, crumbly, and full of preserved fragrance. Medieval cooks used herbs sparingly because they understood their value. A pinch of dried thyme or sage could transform the simplest pot of grains into something satisfying. Even in deep winter, where ingredients were repetitive, herbs provided a touch of life and memory, reminders of the green months past. The way we still rely on dried herbs in winter dishes today is one of the clearest examples of how medieval winter habits remain alive in our kitchens. Bread in deep winter took on an even more important role than it did in early winter. Loaves became tools of survival, but also tools of comfort. Medieval bread was dense, hearty, and built to last. In deep winter, slices of bread might be eaten plain, softened in warm broth, or placed near the fire to revive their texture. Bread also served as a thickener for winter dishes. A piece torn and stirred into a pot helped stretch the meal further and created a smoother texture. Families used every crumb. Nothing was wasted. The sense of resourcefulness that guided bread use in medieval deep winter is still present today when people use stale bread for soups, stuffing, or thickening stews. It's a small but powerful connection to the past. Some medieval households had access to stored dairy products in the early part of winter, but as deep winter continued, dairy became less available. Fresh milk was rare, and even aged dairy needed to be rationed carefully. Hard cheeses, however, lasted well, and families used them sparingly to add flavor. Thin slices or grated shavings might be added to stews or eaten with bread. The careful use of cheese reflected the deeper winter mentality. Nothing abundant, nothing wasted, nothing taken for granted. One of the most defining aspects of deep winter eating was the rhythm of cooking near the hearth. Winter dishes were not fast meals. They were slow, patient creations that simmered for hours while families went about their daily tasks indoors. A pot placed at the edge of the fire could cook gradually throughout the day, thickening slowly and deepening in flavor. Medieval kitchens rarely rushed these meals because rushing wasted fuel and risked burning valuable ingredients. Instead, meals became part of the day's background, soft bubbling, warm aromas, steady heat. This slow-cooking instinct persists in modern winter cuisine, where slow cookers, simmering soups, and long-baked dishes bring the same feeling of gentle warmth. As winter deepened, medieval families also became more mindful of their supplies. They could no longer rely on the top layers of stored food. They had to check deeper into the larder. They examined vegetables carefully, inspected grains, looked for signs of moisture, and kept everything organized. Winter food management became a daily ritual that ensured the family made it to spring with enough variety to stay nourished. Modern households sometimes mimic this without realizing it, checking pantries, planning meals more carefully in winter, and being more thoughtful about ingredients. The emotional aspect of deep winter eating is perhaps the most timeless part of all. Meals weren't just sustenance. They were part of the warmth that made winter bearable. When daylight lasted only a few hours and the cold pressed against the walls, the warmth of a meal carried significance beyond taste. It brought comfort, stability, and reassurance. Families gathered around the hearth not only to eat, but to feel togetherness. The bowl of soup in their hands was both physical warmth and emotional warmth. Today, we still feel this instinct strongly in winter, seeking warm drinks, cozy meals, comforting flavors. Winter food feels different because humans have long connected warmth with safety during the coldest months. Even in deep winter, medieval families found small ways to add variety to their meals. If households kept nuts from earlier months, they might crack a handful to sprinkle over a dish. If they had stored a few apples or pears in a cool space, they might use one to brighten a meal. If someone had dried a small amount of herbs or wild greens, those became treasured additions. These little bursts of variety were not luxuries, they were moments of joy. Modern kitchens still follow this pattern, adding nuts, fruit, spices, or herbs to winter dishes for the same small emotional lift. Another characteristic of deep winter eating was the reliance on second meals made from earlier ones. Stews were thickened and reheated. Porridges left from morning became the base of evening meals. Bread softened in broth turned into the next dish. Medieval cooks rarely created entirely new meals from scratch each time. They extended and transformed leftovers to ensure nothing was wasted. This habit survives strongly today in winter cooking. Leftover soups become thicker the next day, bread is reused, cooked grains become new dishes. Winter naturally encourages this slow recycling because it fits the season's practicality. As deep winter progressed, families began counting the weeks until early spring. They did not hurry the season, they simply acknowledged its length. Their meals reflected a balance of caution and comfort. They rationed carefully, but never eliminated warmth or nourishment. They accepted the season's limits without fear because centuries of tradition had taught them how to meet winter with calm resilience. The foods that carried them through this harshest phase, grains, root vegetables, dried beans, dried fruits, herbs, dense bread, were not glamorous, but they were dependable. They formed the rhythm of winter days. They brought warmth when the world outside was cold. They allowed medieval families not just to survive winter, but to live within it peacefully. Winter in medieval Europe was long, harsh, and demanding, but the meals created during this time were acts of quiet strength. They reflected human adaptability, patience, and the deep understanding that simple food, prepared with care, could sustain mind and body through even the darkest and coldest weeks. In the next chapter, we will explore how medieval families handled the longest stretch of winter, what they did when supplies began to shrink, how they adapted their meals, and how creativity became an essential ingredient when the larder grew thin. As deep winter continued its long, steady grip over medieval Europe, a subtle shift took place inside every household. The earliest part of winter brought confidence, warmth, and a reassuring sense of readiness. Families still had variety in their larders, vegetables in their storage pits, grain stacked safely in bins, herbs hanging from beams, and dried goods waiting to be used. But as the weeks stretched into months, as the cold refused to release its hold, and as the familiar quiet of winter deepened day by day, people began to feel the season's true weight. It wasn't fear, exactly, more like a gentle awareness that now was the time to become careful, thoughtful, and creative. Winter's middle period had its own rhythm, and it demanded calm adaptation. In this longest stretch of winter, nothing outside changed. The ground remained frozen, fields slept under snow, rivers slowed with ice, and the sun rose late only to sink quickly again. With no new ingredients coming from the world beyond the walls, medieval families turned inward with even more focus. They looked more closely at their supplies, counted more carefully, planned more deliberately, and listened even more closely to the quiet voice of experience that generations had passed down. Winter was no longer new. It was settled, serious, and steady. And inside the home, the meals reflected this shift. The first noticeable change was the slow thinning of stored vegetables. Early winter had allowed more variety, but now families began noticing which vegetables softened faster in storage and which remained firm. Cabbage, though a durable winter vegetable, didn't last forever. Potatoes were not yet widely used in medieval Europe, so families relied heavily on carrots, turnips, beets, onions, and leeks. Those that had begun to soften were used first, often cooked into thicker, simpler dishes. Families peeled away soft layers, cut out spots that were no longer usable, and salvaged every good piece they could. Nothing was discarded without care. Even the smallest pieces of vegetables found their way into soups or broths. The idea of waste simply didn't exist in winter and this attitude shaped medieval cooking deeply. As the number of vegetables slowly shrank, the role of grains became even more important. Grain stores were checked more frequently, carefully protected from moisture, pests, or accidental waste. A sack of barley or rye was far more than food. It was winter's safety net. Medieval households treated it with quiet respect. Every scoop mattered. Every handful needed to stretch further than before. In these weeks, porridges and grain-based dishes became even more central to daily meals. They could be made thinner or thicker depending on the family's needs that day. If supplies were low, cooks used more water and fewer grains. If someone needed more nourishment, the pot was thickened. Grain dishes became an art of balance, nourishment controlled carefully by fire, water, and time. The creativity of medieval cooks emerged most clearly during this middle phase of winter. They had fewer fresh ingredients and yet still managed to create meals that warmed the home and kept everyone nourished without exhausting supplies too quickly. One simple but effective method was transforming leftovers into new meals. A pot of grain from the morning could become the base of a stew in the evening. Leftover root vegetables from a midday meal might be mashed and mixed with herbs to create a warm, soft dish for nighttime. Bread that grew hard was soaked in broth, transforming into something softer and satisfying. These transformations were not seen as compromises. They were part of the natural rhythm of winter cooking. Herbs played a different role in this period too. In early winter, herbs were used sparingly but with confidence. But by the middle of winter, families began to ration them carefully, appreciating how much they lifted meals when ingredients grew plainer. A pinch of herbs in a pot of grain could create a sense of variety without using valuable fresh produce. Some households made small blends from what remained of the dried bundles, mixing thyme with a touch of sage, or combining dried leaves to create something fragrant. This small creativity was a quiet comfort, a way to keep meals interesting in a season where monotony was unavoidable. Dried beans and peas became steady companions during this period. Their long cooking time was no obstacle. Medieval households had fires burning throughout the day, and a pot placed at the hearth's edge could soften slowly without wasting fuel. Beans appeared more frequently in winter meals as vegetables dwindled. They added thickness, substance, and warmth to dishes. The act of soaking them overnight became part of the evening routine. Placing them near the fire in a bowl of water, watching them slowly expand, knowing that tomorrow they would help build a satisfying meal. Dried fruits, if families still had any left, were treated almost like treasures. They were no longer used casually, but saved for moments when a meal needed brightness or when spirits felt particularly low. A few slices of dried apple stirred into a pot of hot grain could bring both flavor and emotional lift. Medieval people understood that food supported more than the body, it supported the heart. And in the coldest, darkest stretches of winter, small comforts mattered. Cheese, especially hard cheese, continued to be used sparingly but wisely. A thin shaving added richness to grain dishes or vegetables, stretching flavor much farther than its size suggested. By now, most fresh dairy had long disappeared, so families treated cheese with care, wrapping it carefully and storing it properly. The appearance of cheese on a winter table was a reminder of the work done months earlier, a quiet thread connecting the household to warmer days. One of the most significant challenges of midwinter was managing the larder. This wasn't a formal process. There were no written records or strict plans, but every medieval household had its own instinctive system. Someone checked the vegetables stored in pits or cellars. Someone else watched the grain bins to ensure no moisture had crept in. Another kept an eye on dried foods to make sure they remained safe. If a vegetable looked questionable, it was cooked immediately. If a sack of grain felt slightly warm, an early sign of moisture, it was aired out or used soon. Families understood that winter required vigilance. Small problems could grow quickly if ignored. Meals during this period took on a practical but comforting character. They were not festive, nor were they depressing. They were calm, steady, and made with love. A pot might simmer for hours, slowly softening root vegetables into a broth thickened with grains. A piece of bread might be toasted near the fire until it was warm enough to soften between hands. A handful of herbs might release a quiet fragrance that reminded everyone of warmer months. Food was not only nourishment, it was the emotional anchor that held the household together. Another defining feature of midwinter eating was the importance of portion control, not forced, but thoughtful. Medieval families did not starve themselves in winter. They simply adjusted instinctively. Instead of plates piled high, people served themselves what they needed and saved the rest. Meals were unhurried, eaten with gratitude. There was a deep awareness that winter was long, and every day brought them closer to spring. Meals were not counted by abundance, but by consistency. As long as the family could eat every day, winter was manageable. The hearth played a larger emotional role in midwinter than at any other time of year. It was no longer just a cooking tool or a source of heat. It became the home's beating heart. Meals centered around it not only because it cooked the food, but because it provided the emotional warmth the season demanded. Families gathered closer, talked quietly, shared tasks, and found comfort in the flickering light. The simple act of watching a pot simmer near the hearth brought reassurance. Winter was harsh, but they were prepared. As midwinter continued, some households began trading small amounts of food with neighbors. If one family had more grain and another had more root vegetables, they exchanged small portions. Trade wasn't formal commerce. It was a quiet system of mutual support. In these exchanges, the importance of community became clear. No household survived winter entirely alone. Even today, winter brings people together in similar ways. Neighbors sharing ingredients, friends exchanging food, families helping one another. What meals looked like in this period depended heavily on what a household still had. In the simplest homes, meals might become more repetitive. Thick porridges for breakfast, root vegetable soups for midday, and a bit of bread with herbs for evening. But even in repetition, there was comfort. Children knew what to expect. Adults understood how to build meals that sustained. And the household moved through winter in a rhythm that had been shaped over centuries. In homes with slightly more variety, midwinter meals might occasionally include something special. If dried mushrooms were available, they might be added to a pot for depth of flavor. If someone had saved a small piece of preserved fish, it might be shared carefully. A single dried apple or pear might be softened in warm liquid to create a simple sweet treat. The joy these foods brought wasn't extravagant. It was gentle and quiet, a reminder that winter also held moments of small delight. As the coldest part of the season stretched on, medieval families never lost sight of the fact that winter would eventually end. Every bowl of soup, every piece of bread, every pinched herb was a step towards spring. And because of this perspective, meals carried a meaning beyond nutrition. They were proof that patience worked, that preparation mattered, that the earth, though asleep, would soon awaken again. What ordinary people ate in the middle of winter was a reflection of their ingenuity and their calm acceptance of the season's limits. They didn't resist winter, they flowed with it. They used what they had, saved what they could, and trusted the quiet wisdom passed down through generations. In the next chapter, we'll explore the final stretch of winter, when supplies ran low, when creativity became essential, and when the earliest hints of spring began to influence meals in gentle, hopeful ways. Late winter in medieval Europe was the most delicate part of the entire cold season. Early winter carried confidence. Deep winter carried discipline. But late winter brought a gentle tension that settled quietly over every household. The world outside had not yet woken up. Snow still lay on the ground. Frost still climbed the corners of windows, and the sun still rose reluctantly. But something was different now. Supplies were thinner. The larder echoed more when a hand brushed across its shelves. The grain bins, once heavy and reassuring, now made softer sounds when stirred. The baskets of root vegetables felt lighter, and the bundles of dried herbs had grown smaller. Even dried beans and peas, dependable through most of winter, were touched more carefully because families knew they were nearing the widest stretch of time before spring offered anything fresh. This wasn't a moment of panic. It was a moment of heightened awareness. Medieval families had long expected this late winter thinness. It came every year. Every family, from the wealthiest to the simplest, understood that the cold months had a way of quietly stretching themselves further than expected. And so, during this time, households turned toward creativity with a calm, practiced instinct. They did not lament the dwindling supplies. They adjusted to them. They made meals slimmer, lighter, more thoughtful. They brought out their quietest strategies, their most patient habits, and their most careful ways of making small ingredients feel meaningful. The biggest shift in this part of winter was the growing simplicity of meals. Earlier in the season, even if the food was plain, meals felt full. There were still cabbages, plenty of root vegetables, and a comfortable supply of grains. But now, cabbages might be gone. Only the hardest, most resilient vegetables remained. Carrots, turnips, onions, beets, and even these showed signs of time. The outer layers were peeled more cautiously. Soft spots were trimmed away with steady hands. Families treated every usable piece as valuable because the timing mattered. Spring was coming, but not soon enough to rely on. Every root that lasted another week mattered. Cooking in late winter became more about technique than ingredients. With fewer vegetables and fewer grains, medieval cooks relied heavily on skill, knowing exactly how long to simmer a pot so that everything softened as fully as possible, or how to stretch a small handful of grain into something that warmed the body and lifted the spirit. This period revealed just how intuitive medieval cooking truly was. Measurements were not written, recipes were not read. Instead, experience guided every movement. The tilt of a pot, the distance from the fire, the amount of water added slowly to extend a dish without making it thin or watery. Bread became especially symbolic during late winter. Earlier in the season, bread was predictable, dense loaves made with care and eaten steadily. But as supplies ran thin, medieval households adjusted their baking habits. They baked smaller loaves, using less grain and stretching dough with barley or oats to preserve what little flour remained. Bread was sliced thinner, soaked more frequently in warm broth, and used to thicken dishes that otherwise might feel too sparse. Even small pieces were valued. Crumbs were no longer crumbs, they were ingredients. They could be stirred into a porridge to enrich it or pressed into the bottom of a bowl to catch the flavors of a thin soup. Waste was unthinkable, not because of fear, but because the season demanded quiet efficiency. One of the most remarkable parts of late winter cooking was the way medieval families used water. It seems almost strange to imagine water as an ingredient, but in this season, it played a crucial role. Families learned how to use hot water not simply as a base for cooking, but as a comfort in itself. A pot of water simmered with herbs, onion skins, or even just the ends of vegetables created a simple broth that helped stretch a small amount of grain or vegetables into a full meal. Broths in late winter were rarely rich. They were gentle, soothing, and thoughtfully flavored. Today, many winter broths and herbal teas echo this tradition, offering warmth through simplicity rather than richness. The importance of dried foods reached its peak during this time. Dried beans, if still available, were treasured. Dried fruit was nearly gone unless a family had an especially generous harvest in the previous autumn. Herbs were scattered lightly, almost ceremonially, into pots. Some families even saved the dust and crumble at the bottom of herb bundles to use in these weeks, believing that even the smallest bit of dried fragrance could bring comfort to otherwise plain meals. In some households, there were still small amounts of preserved foods like dried mushrooms, bits of aged cheese, or fragments of salted items left from earlier months. These became rare treats, used with deep intention. A medieval cook might shave the tiniest piece of cheese into a pot, not for volume, but for flavor. A dried mushroom might be soaked, sliced thinly, and added to stretch the sense of variation in a meal. These small touches mattered. They reminded families that even in the thin weeks, winter allowed moments of pleasure. One of the most interesting shifts in late winter was the increased reliance on combinations. Medieval people combined ingredients not to create complex dishes, but to create fullness from what remained. A handful of grains, a few pieces of vegetables, the last of the herbs, and a small amount of broth could be transformed into something nourishing. The recipes weren't new, they were simply adjusted. Thin soups were thickened with bread. Grain porridges were flavored with the last dried fruit. Hot water was enriched with whatever remained of the season's herbs. Meals were not repetitive, they were resourceful. This part of winter also highlighted the emotional aspect of food. In earlier months, food brought comfort through warmth and routine. But now, food brought comfort through familiarity and gentleness. Families expected meals to be smaller and simpler. They didn't resent the season, they understood it. Meals were eaten more slowly, savored more thoughtfully. Children learned from watching adults handle ingredients with care. They saw that late winter required patience, not worry. They understood that food was part of a cycle, one that would renew itself when spring returned. The hearth remained the steady heart of the home, but now its role was more important than ever. It wasn't just a place for cooking, it was a place of reassurance. The sight of something simmering, no matter how simple, reminded everyone that there was still food, still warmth, still enough to carry them through. The fire crackled softly, the pot bubbled slowly, and the room held a sense of quiet gratitude that families rarely put into words. Meals in this part of winter weren't grand, but they were deeply comforting. In some households, trading increased in late winter. If one family had more beans and another had more grain, they traded little amounts, helping one another get through. These trades were not large or formal. They were small, neighborly exchanges based on trust and shared experience. Winter bound communities together more than any other season. People needed each other, and food became a natural reason to connect. Even today, communities sometimes exchange food in winter, sharing dishes, offering help, giving ingredients. Not because they lack resources, but because winter naturally inspires generosity and support. One of the quietest but most meaningful parts of late winter eating was the way medieval families maintained hope through their meals. They didn't know the exact moment spring would reveal itself, but they trusted that it would come. Every time they prepared a meal with dwindling supplies, they were participating in a silent countdown to the Earth's awakening. This sense of patience lives on today. Late winter still feels like the hardest part of the season for many people, even though modern supplies are plentiful. It feels long, slow, and heavy, and people instinctively turn more to warm, simple meals, soups, porridges, breads, echoing the old patterns of perseverance. Despite the limitations, medieval cooks found small sparks of creativity even in these weeks. They experimented with textures, heating methods, and combinations. A vegetable might be mashed instead of sliced. Grain might be toasted lightly before being cooked. Herbs might be added at different stages for subtle variations. Nothing was dramatic, and nothing was wasted. These simple changes helped bring variety to meals without requiring additional ingredients. And then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, late winter began to shift. The light lasted a little longer, the wind changed its tone, and tiny hints of the coming season crept into daily life. The meals didn't change yet. The food was still thin, still simple, but the feeling around meals began to warm. Spring wasn't here, but it was near enough to feel. And this small emotional shift carried families through the last, quietest stretch of the cold months. Late winter meals weren't about survival. They were about resilience. They revealed how much ordinary medieval families understood their environment, how deeply they trusted the cycles of nature, and how skillfully they adapted without complaint. What they ate reflected this patience. Simple grains, softened vegetables, carefully rationed herbs, small bits of preserved foods, and broth that stretched the last remnants of the season. In the next chapter, we will see what happened when the first signs of early spring appeared, when the world began to thaw, when small fresh foods cautiously returned, and when medieval families slowly transitioned from winter habits to new season rhythms. As late winter finally softened and the first hints of early spring crept into medieval Europe, households felt a change that was subtle but unmistakable. The world outside was still cold, still muted, still resting beneath a thin sheen of frost, yet something in the air felt different. Birds began calling earlier in the morning, though their voices were faint. The wind felt less sharp, carrying with it a whisper of warmth even if the temperature remained low. The daylight lingered just a little longer, stretching itself gently across rooftops and leaving the evenings not quite as heavy as before. These were not dramatic changes, just tiny signals that winter was loosening its grip and the earth was preparing to wake again. Inside medieval homes, people felt this shift with a quiet mixture of relief and caution. They knew better than to celebrate early. Winter had a way of returning suddenly, reminding everyone that the season wasn't truly finished. But even so, the presence of light, the softening of winds, and the subtle changes in animals' behavior encouraged families to think beyond the strict routines of winter. Their food supplies were still thin, their larders still modest, yet their minds began to turn toward meals that signaled transition rather than endurance. The first sign of early spring in medieval diets wasn't a fresh vegetable or a sudden abundance of anything. It was simply the change in how people approached their remaining winter supplies. The careful rationing of late winter began to relax slightly. not because families had more food, but because they could finally see an end in sight. The worst was over. The hardest weeks had passed. With that sense of emotional warmth, medieval cooks shifted from purely preservation-focused cooking to meals that had a touch more softness, a touch more hope, a touch more freedom. Root vegetables still dominated early spring meals, but by now, families used the very last of them. Carrots or turnips that remained were often small, wrinkled, and showing signs of time. Yet the way they were used changed. Instead of saving them, families began using the remaining vegetables more liberally, knowing that soon new growth would appear in the fields. These early spring meals had a sense of closure, a finishing of what winter had demanded. Even a simple pot of stew made from the last turnips had a different emotional tone now. It wasn't winter survival anymore, it was winter ending. Grains remained the backbone of meals, but families treated them with a bit more openness. In midwinter, the goal was to stretch every grain as far as possible. Now, families felt they could cook their porridges slightly thicker, making them more filling and comforting. It wasn't extravagance, it was simply a gentler way of eating, reflecting the emotional shift that came with the changing season. Many medieval households poured the last handful of barley or rye into pots deliberately, believing that a hearty, warm meal helped push the season forward in spirit. Herbs, which had been rationed carefully in late winter, were now used with a lighter hand. Instead of pinching herbs with fear of running out, cooks used them because their fragrance symbolized the return of life. A little crushed dried sage or thyme wasn't tea, just a flavor. It was a reminder of the green months ahead. The scent of herbs in early spring kitchens felt like a whisper from summer days, like a soft message from the earth saying, "I'm coming back." One of the most important early spring foods came from storage pits and cellars: onions. Onions stored incredibly well, and many families found that they still had a good supply even as winter ended. Onions played a surprisingly symbolic role during this time. Their steady presence represented the calm endurance that carried households through winter. When cooked into early spring dishes, onions provided flavor, warmth, and a sense of continuity. Whether they were softened in a pot with the last vegetables or simmered slowly into broth, onions helped bridge the gap between winter's heaviness and spring's lightness. Bread, too, marked the arrival of early spring in its own quiet way. In late winter, bread had been small, thin, and stretched to its limit. But now families baked slightly larger loaves, using whatever grain remained with a renewed sense of comfort. These early spring loaves were still dense, still hearty, but they were also symbols of a season shifting. Even the smell of bread felt different, warmer, brighter, carrying hints of the excitement that came with the approaching thaw. Dried beans and peas were still used, but now they were used with a sense of finishing rather than conserving. If a family had a half handful of dried beans left at the bottom of a jar, they used them all at once rather than saving them. The same was true for dried fruits. If a few dried apples or plums remained, families would rehydrate them and add them to meals for comfort. Late winter required strict rationing. Early spring allowed gentle release. One of the quiet miracles of early spring came from the animals. Though fresh dairy had been scarce or non-existent in deep winter, early spring brought tiny changes. Animals that had rested through the coldest months began to produce small amounts of milk again. Not enough for abundance, but enough to give medieval families a sense of renewed life. This early spring milk was treasured. It was heated gently, stirred into porridge, or used to soften bread. Rarely was it used raw. Instead, it became part of warm dishes that added nourishment when people needed it most. The sight of a little milk warming near the hearth was a symbol of promise, a sign that the earth truly was waking. Early spring also meant the return of eggs in some households. Chickens, which laid less or not at all during deep winter, often began laying again as daylight increased. These first eggs of the season were precious. They were not eaten casually. A single egg might be shared in a dish or mixed into dough to strengthen bread. Eggs symbolized renewal, a small but powerful reminder that winter's dormancy was temporary. Though fields and gardens were still barren during early spring, the earliest signs of green could be found if one knew where to look. Medieval people, especially women and older members of the household who understood the land deeply, knew exactly when to begin foraging for tiny green shoots. These were not full vegetables. The earth was far from ready for that. but they were small leafy beginnings that could be added sparingly to meals. Early nettles, young sorrel, tender shoots from wild herbs, and the very first signs of edible greens appeared. These early plants were not plentiful, but they felt magical after months of brown, gray, and white landscapes. A handful of early greens added to a pot of broth transformed it entirely. The flavor wasn't bold, it was fresh. It brought a gentle brightness that could not be found in any dried winter ingredient. Medieval families cherished these early greens not for their volume, but for what they symbolized, the first taste of spring. Another interesting shift in early spring meals was the use of water and broth. In deep winter, thin broths were a way to stretch ingredients. But in early spring, broths took on a more hopeful role. They became the base for soups that included new green shoots or the last vegetables of winter. A broth made from onion skins, dried herbs, and leftover bits of vegetables became a welcoming foundation for new life to enter the pot. These soups often had a lightness that winter meals didn't have, less thick, less heavy, more reflective of the season's transition. Early spring also introduced a shift in mood during mealtime. In winter, meals were eaten quietly, steadily, with a sense of grounding. But now, meals carried a subtle excitement. People talked more about the outdoors, about the fields soon to be prepared, about the first tasks of the planting season. Children were eager to go outside again. Adults were eager to prepare gardens, repair tools, and shake off winter's stillness. This energy seeped into the meals themselves. Even if the dishes were still simple, the atmosphere was different. Meals felt lighter not because of the ingredients, but because of the anticipation. Cooks, too, began thinking differently. Instead of planning how to make each remaining ingredient stretch, they focused on using what they had left while preparing for the new season ahead. The last handfuls of grains were used with intention. The final herbs were sprinkled with appreciation. The last root vegetables were cooked with care, knowing they had carried the household through the harshest months. An especially meaningful part of early spring eating was the ritual of checking the larder one last time. Families looked at what remained and used it in the most meaningful ways. If a few onions were still firm, they became part of a hearty meal. If only one turnip remained, it might be shared among several dishes, each piece reminding everyone of winter's endurance. Even the empty spaces in the larder told a story of months spent in careful balance, months where simple foods carried deep significance. One of the most touching aspects of early spring in medieval households was the return of hope in meals. Winter meals were warm, steady, comforting, but early spring meals were comforting and hopeful. Every bowl of broth, every handful of herbs, every piece of bread carried a quiet optimism. The world had endured winter, and so had the family. Food symbolized survival, renewal, and continuity. As early spring progressed, meals became a bridge between seasons. They contained the last pieces of winter and the first hints of spring. They were not rich, but they were meaningful. They reminded medieval families of their resilience, their connection to the land, and the powerful cycle of nature that shaped every meal. In the next chapter, we'll step fully into the cooking of true spring. When the earth finally wakes, the fields open again, and medieval families start refreshing their diets with new, vibrant ingredients after the long winter's stillness. When true spring finally arrived in medieval Europe, it did not come with sudden color or dramatic warmth. It arrived quietly, gently, almost shyly, as though the earth itself needed time to remember how to wake. The snow did not melt all at once but thinned in slow, delicate stages. The ground softened reluctantly, patches of dark soil peeking through while frost still clung to shaded corners. The trees did not burst into bloom overnight. Instead, small buds appeared cautiously along branches, testing the air. Birds returned gradually, their calls soft at first, then stronger as the days lengthened. And in every medieval household, people felt the world exhale after holding its breath for months. This transition from early spring to true spring changed everything about daily life, especially the way ordinary families approached their food. For the first time in months, the world beyond the larder offered something. Not abundance, not harvest, not plenty, but beginnings. And for medieval people, beginnings were the most precious gifts of all. After months of relying on dried goods, stored vegetables, grains, and the remnants of winter supplies, even the smallest new growth felt miraculous. True spring wasn't just a season. It was hope returning in edible form. In this chapter, we step into this tender moment, when medieval families slowly rebuilt their diets using the earth's earliest offerings, when meals shifted from survival to renewal, and when kitchens once again filled with the sense of fresh growth after a long season of stillness. The first and most immediate sign of true spring in medieval kitchens came from the ground itself. As the soil softened, early greens pushed upward with quiet determination. These were not large vegetables yet. No full heads of cabbage or bulbs of onions or sturdy root vegetables, but delicate shoots, leaves, and early herbs that had been waiting beneath the snow for their chance. Medieval people knew exactly when and where these first greens appeared. Generations of observation had taught them the rhythm of the land, and even children learned to identify these early plants long before they understood the seasons in full. One of the first edible greens was nettle. Though prickly when touched raw, nettles transformed into gentle, nourishing leaves once cooked. Medieval families collected them carefully, often wearing cloth or using thick gloves, then rinsed them and simmered them into broths or porridges. The taste was green, fresh, and lightly earthy, nothing like the dense, stored flavors of winter. A bowl of nettle soup signaled the season unmistakably. It was a simple dish, but after months of repetitive meals, it felt almost luxurious. Alongside nettles came young sorrel, with its bright, almost lemon-like sharpness. Sorrel added vibrancy to early spring stews and broths, giving meals a brightness that winter dishes lacked. Medieval cooks used sorrel sparingly at first, savoring the return of its tangy flavor. Over weeks, as more sorrel appeared, families added larger handfuls to their pots, enjoying the way it brought life to the simplest ingredients. Wild garlic, also called ramsons, was another favorite. Its long, slender leaves carried a gentle garlic aroma, softer than the sharp bite of onions, but unmistakably fresh. Medieval families collected wild garlic in bunches, chopping it into stews, mixing it into dough, or simmering it in broths. The smell of wild garlic near a hearth meant spring had unquestionably arrived. Modern kitchens still celebrate wild garlic for its early season flavor, showing how medieval instincts continue to shape our senses today. These early greens were not the only foods available in true spring, but they were the most immediate. Medieval people cherished them not just for their freshness, but for what they represented: the earth renewing itself, nutrients returning to the soil, and the slow shift from scarcity to abundance. As the days grew warmer, another important spring ingredient emerged: fresh herbs. These were different from the dried herbs of winter. They were bright, fragrant, delicate. Parsley, chives, and early mint appeared first, adding freshness to dishes that had grown heavy and repetitive during the cold months. Medieval cooks welcomed these herbs with special appreciation. Even a small handful of chopped parsley stirred into a pot transformed its aroma, signaling renewal. With the arrival of spring, medieval families also witnessed the revival of their gardens. These gardens were modest by modern standards, but they provided essential early-season foods. Young onions, early carrots, and small radishes appeared gradually. These were not full-grown vegetables yet, but their presence added variety to meals. Their crisp textures and mild flavors were refreshing after months of stored, softened, or dried foods. Families savored them slowly, using the tender tops as well as the roots. One of the most important early garden foods was the spring onion. Mild, fresh, and gently sweet, spring onions were among the first cultivated vegetables ready to eat. Medieval families chopped them finely and stirred them into grain dishes or soups. They used them raw in small, simple meals, enjoying their crispness. Spring onions symbolized the shift from winter's monotony to spring's growing diversity. Another sign of true spring came from the animals. As the weather warmed, dairy became more abundant. Cows and goats produced more milk, and this newfound supply changed medieval meals significantly. Fresh milk meant fresh cheese, soft, young cheeses that felt entirely different from the hard, aged cheeses of winter. These fresh cheeses were gentle, mild, and often eaten with bread or stirred into dishes to add creaminess. Medieval households treasured the first batches of spring cheese because they marked the beginning of a new dairy season after months of rationing. Butter also returned to medieval kitchens in spring. Winter butter was scarce, often hard. and sometimes slightly preserved. But spring butter was soft, fresh, and rich with the flavors of new pasture grasses. Families used it sparingly but gratefully, melting a small pat into warm porridge or spreading it thinly on bread. Even a tiny amount felt generous. Spring butter carried the taste of renewed life. Eggs became more abundant as well. Chickens, who had slowed or stopped laying in the coldest months, grew active again as daylight increased. Spring eggs were a welcome addition to medieval meals. They were used to enrich breads, thicken soups, or create simple dishes that were surprisingly nourishing. Even 1 or 2 eggs could make a difference in meals that had grown thin by late winter. As the season continued, fish appeared more frequently in the diets of communities near rivers or coasts. Spring was a time when waterways grew more active. Families who lived near streams or lakes would sometimes gather small fish or freshwater species that became available as ice melted. These early spring catches were not abundant, but they added welcome protein to meals. They were often simmered gently in broths or cooked with early greens. Fish added lightness to spring dishes, balancing the warming foods of winter. Medieval families also began making small trips beyond their homes as the earth softened. They checked for wild roots, mushrooms, and early edible shoots. They foraged through forests and fields not because they lacked food at home, but because spring offered new flavors, and foraging had always been part of daily life. Wild food collection was as familiar as tending a garden. It provided variety, nutrition, and a deeper connection to the changing seasons. During true spring, the rhythm of cooking shifted too. Winter meals had been slow, heavy, and long simmered. Spring meals were lighter. They simmered for shorter periods. They used fresh water instead of thick winter broths. They highlighted fresh greens rather than dried ones. Pots still sat near the hearth, but the ingredients inside them reflected the new season's energy. Meals tasted cleaner, brighter, softer. Even their aromas filled homes differently, less smoky, more herbal. Bread changed in this season as well. With fresh dairy and eggs available again, bread dough became softer and slightly richer. Even if families didn't add these ingredients directly, the presence of spring warmth made rising easier, baking steadier, and textures gentler. Medieval bread in spring often had a lighter crumb and a softer crust, reflecting the season's abundance even before harvest had arrived. The emotional atmosphere of mealtime shifted again. Winter eating had been grounded in survival and routine. Early spring eating had felt hopeful. True spring eating carried gratitude. Families didn't need to worry quite so intensely about rationing. They could breathe. They could look at their meals not as calculations, but as small celebrations of endurance and renewal. Children felt the change most eagerly. They helped gather greens, pluck early herbs, and watch for eggs. The taste of fresh foods after months of winter simplicity brought joy that adults recognized too. Meals became moments of discovery. Look what the earth has given us today. Medieval households, though practical, were often deeply appreciative of nature's slow offerings. Even with spring underway, medieval families didn't abandon winter supplies entirely. Grains remained important. Dried beans were still used. The last bits of stored vegetables were added to meals. But now these ingredients mingled with fresh foods, creating dishes that blended winter's nourishment with spring's brightness. This blending made meals feel whole and transitional, reflecting the earth's gradual return to life. True spring also marked the beginning of preparation for the next cycle. Medieval families cleaned their storage rooms, checked their tools, and made plans for planting. Their meals, too, reflected this readiness. Lighter foods supported longer days spent outside, repairing fences, preparing soil, and beginning the early sowing. Families ate foods that carried both energy and ease, helping them shift from winter's quiet stillness to spring's gentle work. In many ways, spring meals were the most symbolic meals of the year. They carried memory, hope, renewal, and connection. The first green shoots remembered winter's darkness. The first eggs remembered the dormancy of deep cold. The first fresh herbs remembered the quiet rationing of late winter. And every bite reminded medieval families that they and the earth moved through seasons together, enduring, resting, waking, and beginning again. What ordinary people ate in true spring was not extravagant. It was simple, bright, gentle, and deeply meaningful. It represented the balance between what remained of winter and what was beginning anew. And long before modern calendars and clocks regulated the year, medieval meals told them exactly where they were in the cycle of life. In the next chapter, we'll explore how medieval families prepared for the next harvest season, how spring food led naturally into planting, gathering, and the quiet foundation of the next year's winter survival. By the time true spring had taken firm hold and the earth had awakened fully, medieval families began to prepare for the next great cycle of food, the harvest season that would come months later. This preparation was not sudden, dramatic, or frantic. It was gentle and rhythmic, shaped by generations of understanding that winter might have ended, but the memory of it was still fresh. Households, still savoring the taste of early greens and tentative spring herbs, now turned their attention toward building back what winter had slowly emptied. And just as winter required patience, spring required intention. These months between the end of winter and the beginning of real summer growth were some of the busiest in the medieval year, yet they carried a quiet, steady energy. Even the food families ate reflected the tasks at hand. Meals became lighter, cleaner, and often simpler, not because supplies were limited, but because the season's work required it. Medieval diets always mirrored the land, and when the land hummed with labor, meals became practical companions to long days. One of the first priorities in preparing for the next harvest season was tending to the garden, the smaller patches of land near the home where families could control what grew. Medieval gardens were not just places for vegetables. They were living pantries, medicine chests, herb cupboards, and sources of daily nourishment. After winter, these gardens needed care. Families cleared away the remains of old growth, loosened the soil, and checked for signs of new shoots. Every garden, no matter how modest, represented the heart of food security. As the soil warmed, families planted small, fast-growing crops that would help refill their tables quickly. Radishes, lettuce, early carrots, and young peas were common choices. These vegetables didn't replace the winter staples entirely, but they helped ease the transition, offering fresh tastes while the larger crops took their time. Medieval people understood that these early plantings were not luxury. They were essential steps in rebuilding strength after months of careful rationing. Many families also planted herbs in early spring: parsley, chives, fennel, mint, and more. Herbs were not simply flavorings. They helped stretch meals, bringing brightness to dishes that were still grounded in grains and simple vegetables. Herbs grew quickly and generously, often offering early harvests. Their presence in spring kitchens helped medieval families shift emotionally from winter's heaviness to spring's optimism. While gardens were being tended, the fields that surrounded medieval villages demanded their own share of work. Plowing, sowing, repairing fences, clearing stones. All these tasks began at once. These efforts were physically demanding, and meals reflected this need for strength. While winter food had been about insulation and warmth, spring food was about energy. Families turned to grains and simple broths that provided steady nourishment. Porridges returned as morning meals, not because supplies were low, but because they were practical for workers heading into the fields. Midday meals were often eaten outdoors: simple bread, early cheese, maybe a handful of greens. These meals were not indulgent. They were steady fuel for steady work. As spring progressed, medieval families carefully monitored their remaining stores from winter. They did not abandon them simply because spring had arrived. Instead, they used them strategically, mixing winter stores with new spring produce to make the season's food last as long as possible. If a family still had grains left from winter, they continued using them alongside fresh greens. If onions or garlic remained in the cellar, they stretched them into multiple dishes. Even dried beans or peas from winter stores found their way into spring meals. This blending of old and new ingredients created a sense of continuity, a gentle reminder that seasons connected rather than replaced one another. Bread continued to be a stable presence on the medieval table, but spring brought subtle changes. With dairy more available and temperatures more predictable, dough behaved differently. Spring bread often had a softer crust, slightly more rise, and a gentler texture. Medieval families noticed these changes, even if they didn't articulate them the way modern bakers might. The feel of dough under the hands, the way it expanded near the hearth, the scent it released. These changes quietly signaled that the long winter truly had passed. Spring also brought opportunities for foraging beyond early greens. As the forests and meadows awakened, families searched for edible flowers, tender shoots, young mushrooms, and early roots. These foraged foods added variety to spring meals. They were not plentiful enough to replace crops, but they offered small bursts of flavor that made meals feel new. Gathering wild foods was not a hobby or a leisure activity. It was a natural extension of medieval life. The knowledge of where, when, and how to forage safely was passed down through generations, woven into the rhythms of childhood and adulthood alike. As the land grew busier and brighter, medieval families began thinking not just about the immediate season, but about the winter ahead. It might seem early to think of winter when spring had just begun, but preparation for harsh seasons was constant. Every seed planted, every shoot nurtured, every tool repaired was part of a larger plan that stretched months ahead. Medieval families did not separate seasons sharply. They understood them as connected steps in an endless cycle of eating, growing, storing, and surviving. In this preparation, the kitchen played a central role. Though winter's heavy meals were gone, the kitchen remained a place of planning. Cooks watched carefully how much remained of winter's supply, ensuring nothing spoiled unnecessarily. They adjusted meal sizes based on the season's demands. They used fresher ingredients in ways that left enough preserved goods for unexpected delays in harvest. Even as they enjoyed spring's freshness, medieval families knew that winter would return, and careful planning was their quiet way of respecting that truth. One of the most significant spring tasks in medieval households was preparing to preserve food again, long before the crops were ready. They cleaned storage areas, checking every corner of the larder for signs of dampness. They aired out sacks, repaired baskets, scrubbed barrels, and prepared wooden shelves. These tasks were not glamorous, but they were essential. A well-prepared storage space could make the difference between a smooth winter and a difficult one. Medieval families understood that storage was not an afterthought. It was the backbone of survival. As spring moved toward early summer, medieval families began to enjoy more substantial foods. Young vegetables grew larger, greens became more abundant, herbs thrived, milk output increased, eggs were plentiful, and fresh cheeses appeared more often on the table. Meals became more colorful and varied, reflecting the season's generosity. Still, even as families enjoyed these foods, they used them with restraint. Medieval people rarely indulged recklessly. They savored gradually, always mindful of the work ahead. This restraint was not fear, it was wisdom. It was an understanding passed through centuries that each season brought gifts, but also responsibilities. Spring was generous, but its generosity came with a promise: prepare well, and the year will reward you. Neglect the early tasks, and winter will remind you. Medieval people accepted this relationship with the land as naturally as they breathed. It was not superstition or anxiety. It was simply the truth of their world. The spring season also introduced more social eating moments. After months of being confined indoors by winter's demands, families and neighbors began to share small meals outside. Perhaps they gathered near the edge of a field, eating from shared baskets. Perhaps they met at the edge of a forest while foraging. These meals were simple: bread, cheese, greens, maybe a bit of dried fruit, but they carried deep emotional warmth. Eating outside after winter felt like rejoining the world. Spring cooking also required more flexibility. Unlike winter meals that relied on consistency and planned staples, spring meals depended on what appeared first, what grew fastest, what survived the cold, and what the land offered unexpectedly. Cooks adapted constantly, substituting one green for another, adding herbs when they grew more abundant, adjusting dishes based on garden progress. This adaptability helped medieval families transition from strict winter survival to the more flowing rhythm of warmer seasons. As spring neared its end, medieval households found themselves in a unique moment of balance. They were not yet enjoying summer's full abundance, but they were far beyond winter's scarcity. Their meals combined fresh and stored ingredients. Their gardens were growing steadily. Their fields were green with promise. And their kitchens reflected a growing confidence that the year's hardest season was behind them. Perhaps the most beautiful aspect of this time was how medieval families intertwined past and future through food. Every time they used the last of their winter beans or baked a loaf with the final scoop of old grain, they honored the work that had carried them through the cold months. Every time they planted a seed or watered a young plant, They invested in the meals that would carry them through the next winter. Spring meals, therefore, sat at the intersection of memory and preparation, a quiet balance that shaped medieval life profoundly. In the next chapter, we'll explore how medieval communities relied on one another through these seasons, how food sharing, cooperation, and quiet generosity helped everyone endure winter and prepare for the harvest ahead. As medieval Europe moved from spring into summer and then onward into autumn, one truth remained constant across all seasons, all villages, and all households. Survival, especially through winter, was never an individual task. It was something held together by neighbors, shaped by shared routines, and strengthened by the quiet cooperation that flowed through every community. What ordinary people ate in the harshest months of the year was not just a reflection of what they had stored or grown. It was a reflection of the people around them, the unspoken agreements that bound them, and the way entire communities leaned gently on one another when the world grew cold and still. In this chapter, we explore how medieval communities worked together, sometimes subtly, sometimes directly, to ensure that winter never belonged to any single household alone. It was a collective effort, woven quietly through daily life. This sense of togetherness influenced how people prepared their food, shared their meals, and supported one another when supplies grew thin. And though centuries have passed, many of these gentle habits still echo in modern neighborhoods, especially in colder seasons, when people instinctively draw closer to one another. The foundation of medieval communal strength began long before winter arrived. In the months leading up to the cold season, families helped each other with harvest tasks, not because they were paid, not because they expected anything in return, but because the community depended on the harvest being successful for everyone. If one family's field was left unattended because someone was ill or overwhelmed, neighbors stepped in. They helped gather grains, pull vegetables from the soil, or carry heavy loads. They understood that winter didn't care whose crops failed. If one household suffered, the whole village felt the strain. Everyone's well-being was tied together, woven through shared land, shared labor, and shared knowledge. This cooperative spirit carried into food storage as well. While each household managed its own larder, families often shared methods, tools, and even space. A neighbor with a cooler cellar might store another family's vegetables temporarily. Someone with extra jars or cloths might offer them to a household that needed more preservation supplies. These exchanges were never dramatic. They were simply part of the steady rhythm of life. People didn't announce their help. They simply acted, quietly ensuring that winter preparations felt lighter for everyone. As winter settled in, this sense of shared responsibility became even more visible. The first snowflakes had a way of bringing neighbors into closer conversation. People checked on one another, not out of formality, but because it was natural. If someone had fewer root vegetables than expected, a neighbor might slip a handful of turnips or onions into their storage. If a family's grain sack tore or grew damp, others stepped in with small amounts of their own supplies. These gestures rarely appeared grand. They were often modest, almost invisible, but they created a network of small kindnesses that helped entire communities move through winter with steadiness. Meals themselves became communal experiences in subtle ways. While families usually ate within their own homes, food traditions flowed across walls. If someone made a particularly warm or hearty dish, they sometimes shared a small bowl with an elderly neighbor or a child in another household. In the harshest part of winter, these gestures carried emotional warmth that matched the physical nourishment. A pot of stew offered by one family to another might mean a great deal more than the ingredients it contained. It meant reassurance, connection, and the knowledge that the community's strength was being shared. Winter gatherings, though small and sparse due to the cold, became essential moments for keeping morale high. People might gather near a hearth, bringing small contributions, perhaps a piece of bread from one family, dried herbs from another, or a little preserved fruit from a third. These gatherings were not feasts or celebrations. They were gentle reminders that even in the darkest season, shared warmth mattered. The simple act of sitting together, listening to the fire crackle, and exchanging quiet stories helped communities bond. These evenings created memories that lasted long after winter had passed. If a household fell ill during winter, the community stepped in immediately. Illness didn't just affect the sick. It threatened food routines, chores, firewood collection, and everything needed for survival. Neighbors instinctively helped. One might bring water, another might help tend the fire. Someone else might deliver a simple meal of broth and grain. These acts of care weren't formal obligations. They were expressions of the community's understanding that every household was a thread in the same woven fabric. Pull one too hard, and the whole cloth weakened. Children also played a part in this communal structure. They often ran errands between homes, carrying small baskets of food, messages, or herbs. It was common for a child to appear at a neighbor's doorstep with a handful of dried apples, or a bit of fresh spring cheese, or a warm piece of bread. These deliveries weren't always planned. Sometimes they were spontaneous acts of kindness taught by example. Children saw adults sharing, and they learned that sharing was part of life. Winter especially taught them that generosity mattered most precisely when resources were limited. And when supplies grew thin in late winter, neighbors leaned on one another more consciously. Households that had stored more generously might share a little grain or a few vegetables with those whose supplies were dwindling. Not every family had the same fortune during the harvest. Some years produced uneven yields. Some households had more workers, others fewer. The community understood these differences and balanced them through quiet exchanges. If a family found itself with extra dried beans, they might pass some along. If another had herbs left when others had none, they shared them. These exchanges weren't charity. They were mutual care woven into the season's fabric. Even the act of checking on one another became part of the winter rhythm. People listened for the sound of neighbors' fires. They noticed whether smoke rose from a chimney or not. They observed footprints in the snow. If a home looked too quiet, someone visited. These visits often came with a small token of food, a bit of bread, a small bowl of broth, or a few handfuls of grain. The food itself was symbolic, a gentle way of saying, "You are not alone. We face winter together." In some medieval communities, especially smaller ones, families would occasionally pool their resources for a single shared meal during winter. It wasn't a feast. It was a blending of whatever small ingredients each family could offer. One might bring a bit of dried peas, another a handful of barley, another a small piece of preserved vegetable. The resulting pot was not special by modern standards, but it carried extraordinary meaning. It represented unity. It showed that even in scarcity, people could create abundance through togetherness. These communal dishes often carried stories from past winters, reminding everyone that they were part of a long tradition of collective resilience. Spring did not end this communal bond, it strengthened it. As early greens appeared, neighbors often shared their first findings. Someone might gather extra wild garlic and distribute it. Someone else might pass along their first handful of garden herbs. Spring eggs, precious after winter scarcity, were sometimes shared with households that still had few. The generosity of spring became a continuation of winter's care. It wasn't about what someone had, it was about what someone could offer. During the planting season, community cooperation became even more important. Neighbors helped one another prepare fields, repair tools, and plant crops. These shared efforts weren't just practical, they emotionally connected families to one another. They reminded everyone that the next winter would come, and that they would face it better if they supported one another through the seasons leading up to it. The early food of spring strengthened bodies, but the shared labor strengthened spirits. And when summer finally arrived, bringing its abundance of fresh produce, medieval communities celebrated quietly, not with grand feasts, but with simple gatherings where fresh vegetables, early fruits, and new bread were shared. These moments were soft acknowledgments that the hardest season had been endured together. But even as they enjoyed summer's offerings, people remembered winter. They knew that everything they harvested, stored, and prepared in these warmer months would once again become the backbone of winter survival. This constant cycle of giving and receiving shaped medieval diets in ways modern life rarely highlights. Winter wasn't just a test of food, it was a test of community. And because medieval communities met that test with cooperation, the food people ate in winter tasted not only of grains, vegetables, and herbs, but also of shared strength, kindness, and the collective quiet agreement that no household should face the cold alone. In the next chapter, we'll explore how all of these experiences, winter endurance, spring renewal, shared work, and collective preparation, shaped the emotional meaning of food in medieval life, connecting households not just to the land, but to one another through every season of the year. When we look back at medieval winters from the comfort of modern life, it can be tempting to think of the cold months solely in practical terms. The grain that sustained families, the vegetables that lasted the longest, the careful preservation methods, the slow-cooked dishes that warmed homes. But for ordinary medieval people, food during winter was never just survival. It shaped how they saw the world, how they remembered the year, how they connected with family and neighbors, and how they understood themselves. In many ways, the emotional meaning behind their winter foods was as important as the meals themselves. Every bowl of porridge, every piece of bread, every warm pot simmering near the hearth carried memories, hopes, worries, and comfort that traveled far beyond the ingredients. This final chapter gently explores that emotional side, the side that reveals why medieval winter food was more than necessity. It was a thread connecting people to their past, to their present companions, and to the seasons yet to come. And strangely enough, many of these emotional patterns still exist today, even if we rarely notice them. For medieval families, winter meals were deeply tied to memory. The first cold nights in late autumn brought familiar rituals: checking the larder, trimming vegetables for storage, hanging herbs from beams, stacking firewood. These tasks awaken memories from the previous year: successful moments, difficult weeks, foods that ran out too early, meals that carried the family through trouble. Even children absorb these memories. They watch their parents preparing for winter and learn the stories attached to each step. This shelf held last year's herbs. This barrel kept our grains safe. This basket helped us make it through the longest cold. Winter food wasn't only physical, it was a living record of the household's resilience. When deep winter arrived, each meal carried emotional weight. A pot of grain wasn't just something to fill the stomach. It represented all the work done in the warmer months, all the careful tending, storing, and rationing. A bowl of warm broth carried stories of how last year's harvest was gathered, how the herbs were dried, how the vegetables survived storage. Eating these foods reminded medieval people of their connection to the land. They could trace every bite back to a field, a garden, a forest, a stream. In a world without packaged goods or distant suppliers, the origins of food were never a mystery. They were part of a person's identity. Bread, especially, held powerful emotional meaning. In winter, bread was not simply an item on the table, it was an anchor. Every family had its own way of baking. Some loaves were round and dense, others long and slightly softer. The smell of baking bread during winter softened the season's heaviness. It brought comfort even before it was eaten. Medieval people understood that bread connected generations. The techniques, proportions, and habits used to prepare winter bread were passed down quietly, shaping the sounds, scents, and flavors of a household. When someone tore a warm slice in the middle of winter, they were partaking in a tradition older than their grandparents. Winter food also carried emotional meaning in the way it drew families close together. During warmer months, households were often scattered. Some people worked in fields, some tended animals, others gathered herbs or managed the home. But in winter, everyone naturally moved closer to the hearth. Meals became the center of daily life. The act of eating wasn't rushed. People sat together longer, talking softly, warming their hands around bowls, sharing stories. The hearth fire illuminated faces, and the simple meal in front of them felt like the center of the world. These gatherings were not formal or planned. They were simply what happened when the cold narrowed the world to a few warm spots. Children especially felt the emotional warmth of winter meals. They learned that winter was not something to fear if the hearth was glowing and the pot was simmering. They associated certain foods with comfort: thick porridges on dark mornings, warm bread at dusk, a small handful of dried fruit on a rare late winter day. These impressions stayed with them into adulthood, shaping how they understood the season. And even if they grew up and moved to new homes, those memories traveled silently alongside them. Winter foods became emotional landmarks. As the coldest weeks stretched on, food often became the language of care. If someone in the family was tired, someone else might prepare a slightly thicker dish to bring them strength. If a child felt restless, a warm cup of herbal broth might soothe them. If a neighbor visited, even during the coldest days, offering a bite of something warm was a quiet way of saying, "You're welcome here." These acts were small, but they carried immense emotional weight. They showed that food was love in winter, expressed not through extravagance, but through warmth and presence. The emotional meaning of winter food deepened when supplies grew thin. Late winter, with its dwindling vegetables and nearly empty grain sacks, could have brought fear, but it rarely did. Instead, it brought a sense of collective resilience. When a family cooked the last of their turnips or soaked the final handful of beans, they felt not despair, but pride. The meal represented not scarcity, but endurance. It symbolized the reality that they had navigated the hardest part of the year with wisdom and patience. The very act of eating the last of winter's stores reminded medieval people of the cycle of life, endings that led to beginnings, quiet moments that preceded renewal. Emotional meaning also came from the relationship between food and nature. Medieval people were deeply aware of the seasons, not through forecasts or calendars, but through the land itself. The earthy weight of winter dishes, the freshness of early greens in spring, the abundance of summer vegetables, and the deep flavors of autumn harvests formed an unbroken emotional cycle. Winter food was not an isolated part of the year. It was the mirror that reflected everything else. Its simplicity reminded people of the importance of work in spring, care in summer, and preparation in autumn. Winter food taught patience. It taught trust in the earth. It taught acceptance of time. Then came the shift into spring, when the first nettle soup simmered near the hearth, or when the first handful of herbs was chopped into a pot. Medieval families felt something that food alone could not explain: a sense of release. It wasn't merely the taste of something new after months of winter sameness. It was the feeling that they had made it. Every winter memory, every bowl of porridge, every slow stew, every shared meal carried them to this moment. The emotional meaning of spring foods was amplified by winter's quiet endurance. A simple green sprouting from the soil felt almost sacred in its reminder that the earth was returning. Food also shaped identity through community. As we explored in the previous chapter, medieval life was woven from shared experiences, and winter brought out this interconnectedness more than any other season. The sharing of food, whether it was a small piece of bread, a ladle of soup, or a few dried beans, created emotional bonds that were stronger than any written agreement. People remembered who had helped them through difficult winters. Families formed unspoken alliances of generosity. Children grew up knowing exactly which households they could turn to in times of need. Food in winter wasn't just nourishment. It was a quiet, powerful expression of belonging. The emotional meaning extended beyond households and into the structure of medieval rhythm. People measured time by the foods they ate. Early winter meals meant the season had begun. Midwinter dishes marked the period of greatest endurance. Late winter meals signaled the approach of spring. First spring greens announced a new cycle. Every dish was a marker on the seasonal journey. Even today, people still feel echoes of this ancient rhythm. We crave different foods in different seasons, often without knowing why. Our bodies remember patterns older than any recipe. What's most remarkable is that medieval people did not consciously reflect on these emotional connections. They didn't sit by the fire thinking about symbolism or memory. They simply lived it. But through their meals, they carried centuries of inherited knowledge, a quiet understanding that food connects people to each other, to nature, to time, and to themselves. This emotional relationship with food helped medieval people endure harsh winters year after year. It reminded them that warmth could come from a simple bowl, that comfort could be found in the repetition of meals, that community could be strengthened through small offerings, and that survival was not cold logic, but gentle shared humanity. And though centuries have passed, the emotional patterns remain surprisingly familiar. Today, people still gather around warm meals when the weather turns cold. They still find comfort in simple dishes during winter. They still prepare foods that reflect the season, whether they realize the history behind it or not. Winter soups, warm bread, porridges, roasted root vegetables. These comfort foods feel right not because of habit alone, but because of deep emotional memory passed through hundreds of generations. In the stillness of medieval winter kitchens, where the fire glowed softly and families ate slowly, food meant more than nourishment. It was time. It was memory. It was comfort. It was connection. And it was the thread that shaped every era of the year. In the next part, the conclusion, we will gently gather all of these threads together and reflect on what medieval winter eating truly meant and why its quiet lessons continue to echo in our modern lives today. As our journey through medieval winters comes to an end, we can finally step back and see the full picture of what ordinary people truly ate and why it mattered so deeply. Their meals were never just about ingredients or recipes. They were about rhythm, about patience, about survival shaped not by fear, but by quiet preparation and steady trust in the turning of the seasons. Winter, with all its darkness and cold, taught medieval families how to stretch time, how to rely on one another, and how to let simple food carry them through the longest, stillest months of the year. We watched them gather grains in summer, store vegetables in autumn, cook warm porridges in the first weeks of winter, simmer hearty stews in the deep cold, and stretch the last ingredients in the thin days of late winter. We followed them into early spring, when the earth whispered its return through young greens and tender shoots. We stood in their kitchens as they blended dried foods with fresh finds, baked bread that reflected the season, and created meals that honored both memory and renewal. Most of all, we saw how food held emotional weight, how every bowl, every loaf, every simmering pot connected families to their past, their neighbors, and the land itself. Winter revealed who they were: patient, resourceful, gentle, and connected. And even now, centuries later, the echoes remain. The warm soups we crave in winter, the slow-cooked dishes, the early greens we welcome in spring. These instincts are not new. They are old, carried quietly through time by countless hands and countless winters. Thank you for drifting through this peaceful story tonight. If this calm journey helped you relax or rest your mind, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling us where you're re-watching from or which era you'd like to explore next. Your support keeps these soft bedtime histories alive. Sleep well, and until next time, good night.